Spring Ethics Forum. My name is Professor James Kirtley. I'm a Silha Professor of Media Ethics and Law here at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. I'm also the Director of the Silha Center. Tonight's Ethics Forum is one of many events that the Silha Center sponsors during the year, including our annual Silha Lecture that's held in the autumn. In addition, we also publish the Silha Bulletin, which comes out 3 times a year and analyzes current media law and ethics issues. There are a few copies of the Silha Bulletin on the table, and I welcome you to take them with you. If you're interested in being added to our mailing list or to subscribe to the Bulletin, please fill out one of the comment cards that we're making available at the conclusion of the lecture. The Silha Center was founded 25 years ago thanks to the generous support of the late Otto Silha and his wife Helen. Helen is here tonight with her daughter Alice Ryman and grandson David. Please join me in thanking the Silha family for their commitment to the First Amendment and to ethical journalism. As grateful as we are to the Silha family, tonight's lecture could not have taken place without the generous co-sponsorship of the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts, the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, the Minnesota Journalism Center, and Professor Mark Penalty. We're grateful to all of them for helping to make this event tonight possible. If you've seen the Academy Award-winning film The Hurt Locker, then you're already familiar with tonight's speaker. The opening title quotation is taken from his 2002 book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And in case you haven't seen the movie, it reads like this: the rush of battle is often a potent and lethal addiction, for war is a drug. Chris Hedges is a journalist and author who has spent nearly 20 years as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He has reported from more than 50 countries for the Christian Science Monitor, NPR, and Dallas Morning News. He was part of a team of reporters at the New York Times that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for that paper's coverage of global terrorism. He's also received Amnesty International's Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. He holds a BA in English Literature from Colgate University, a Master of Divinity from Harvard, where he was also a Nieman Fellow. He has taught at Columbia, Princeton, and NYU. But that's just part of the story. Chris Hedges has been imprisoned by the Iraqi National Guard, beaten by the Saudi police, deported from Libya and Iran, and fired on by Serbian snipers. And he's been under attack in the United States, too. In 2003, while delivering the commencement address at Rockford College in Illinois, his remarks about the war in Iraq were met with boos and jeers. His microphone was cut off twice, and 2 young men climbed on stage to try to stop him from speaking. His speech was denounced by the Wall Street Journal, and he was reprimanded by the New York Times, allegedly for undermining the public trust in the paper's impartiality. After that, he left the paper to become a fellow at the Nation Institute and to write a weekly column for the Truth Dig website. Clearly, Chris Hedges is not one to shy away from controversy, as you can discern from the title of his lecture tonight, The Propaganda State, the Inordinate Influence of Public Relations on the Press. To deliver a speech with that title in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where the Strat-Com majors outnumber the journalism majors, takes a very special kind of courage. Please join me in welcoming Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much. In celebrity culture, we destroy what we worship. The commercial exploitation of Michael Jackson's death was orchestrated by the corporate forces that rendered Jackson insane. Jackson, robbed of his childhood and surrounded by vultures that preyed on his fears and weaknesses, was so consumed by self-loathing, he carved his African-American face into a Caucasian death mask. He hid his apparent pedophilia behind a Peter Pan illusion of eternal childhood. He could not disentangle his public and his private self. He became a commodity, a product, one to be sold, used, and manipulated. He was infected by the moral nihilism and personal disintegration that is at the core of our corporate culture. And his fantasies of eternal youth, delusions of majesty, and desperate, disfiguring quests for physical transformation were an expression of our own yearning. He was a reflection of us in the extreme. His memorial service, a variety show with a coffin, had an average of 31.1 million television viewers. It was the final episode of the long-running Michael Jackson series, and the stories that enthrall us are real-life stories, early fame, wild success, and then a long, bizarre, and macabre emotional train wreck. O.J. Simpson offered a tamer version of the same plot. So does John Edwards and Britney Spears. Jackson, by the end, was heavily in debt and had weathered a $22 million out-of-court settlement to Jordy Chandler, as well as 7 counts of child sexual abuse and 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent in order to commit a felony. Jackson reflected our own physical and psychological disintegration, especially with many Americans struggling with overwhelming debt, loss of status, and deep personal confusion. The lurid drama of Jackson's personal life meshed perfectly with the ongoing dramas on television, in movies, and in the news. News reports on television are mini-dramas, and they come complete with a star, a villain, a supporting cast, a good-looking host, and a dramatic and often unexpected ending. In Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury's novel about a future dystopia, people spend most of the day watching giant television screens that show endless scenes of police chases and criminal apprehensions. Life, Bradbury understood, once it was packaged, scripted, given a narrative, and filmed, became the most compelling form of entertainment. And Jackson was a great show. He deserved a great finale. Those who created Jackson's public persona and turned him into a piece of property, first as a child and finally as a corpse, encased in a $15,000 golden casket, are the agents, publicists, marketing departments, plastic surgeons, movie producers, advertisers, wardrobe consultants, and television personalities who orchestrate the vast stage of celebrity for profit. They are the puppet masters. No one achieves celebrity status. No cultural illusion is swallowed as reality without these armies of cultural enablers and intermediaries. The producers at the Staples Center in Los Angeles made sure the 18,000 attendees and television audience, and even the BBC, devoted 3 hours to the tribute, watched a funeral that was turned into another maudlin form of uplifting popular entertainment. The memorial service for Jackson was a celebration of celebrity. There was the queasy sight of groups of children, including his own, singing over the coffin. Brooke Shields, fighting back tears, recalled how she had a 33-year-old Jackson, who always maintained that he was a straight male, broke into Elizabeth Taylor's room the night before her wedding because Michael was too excited to wait until morning to see the wedding gown. Shields and Jackson at Taylor's wedding then, quote, pretended to be the mother and father of Elizabeth Taylor. It sounds weird, Shields said, but we made it real. There were photo montages in which a shot of Michael Jackson shaking hands with Nelson Mandela was immediately followed by one of him with Kermit the Frog. Celebrity culture reduces all of the famous to the same level. Fame is its own denominator, And every anecdote told about Jackson seemed to confirm that when you spend your life as a celebrity, you have no idea who you are. And yet, we measure our lives by these celebrities. We seek to be like them. We emulate their look and behavior. We escape the messiness of real life through the fantasy of their stardom. We too long to attract admiring audiences for our grand, ongoing life movie. We try to see ourselves moving through our life as a camera would see us, mindful of how we hold ourselves, how we dress, what we say. We invent movies that play inside our heads with us as stars. We wonder how an audience would react. Celebrity culture has taught us almost unconsciously to generate interior, personal screenplays. We have learned ways of speaking and thinking that grossly disfigure the way we relate to the world and those around us. Neil Gabler, who has written wisely about this, argues that celebrity culture is not a convergence of consumer culture and religion, so much as a hostile takeover of religion by consumer culture. Jackson desperately feared growing old. He believed he could manipulate race and gender. He transformed himself through surgery and perhaps female hormones from a brown-skinned African-American male to a chalk-faced androgynous figure with no clear sexual identity. And while he pushed these boundaries to the extreme, he only did what many Americans do. There were 12 million cosmetic plastic surgery procedures performed last year in the United States. They were performed because in America, most human beings, rich and poor, famous and obscure, have been conditioned to view themselves as marketable commodities. They are objects, like consumer products. They have no intrinsic value. They must look fabulous and live on fabulous sets. They must remain young. They must achieve notoriety and money, or the illusion of it, to be a success. And it does not matter how they get there. Celebrity culture licenses a dark voyeurism into other people's humiliation, pain, weakness, and betrayal. Education, building community, honesty, transparency, and sharing are qualities that will see you ridiculed and voted off any reality show. Fellow competitors for prize money and a chance for fleeting fame elect to disappear the unwanted. In the final credits of the reality show America's Next Top Model, a picture of the woman expelled during the episode vanishes from the group portrait on the screen. Those cast aside become, at least to the television audience, non-persons, celebrities that can no longer generate publicity, good or bad, vanish. Life, these shows teach, is a brutal world of unadulterated competition and a constant quest for notoriety and attention. Our self-exaltation permits the humiliation of those who oppose us. Those who lose deserve to be erased. Those who fail, those who are deemed ugly, ignorant, or poor, are belittled and mocked. Human beings are used, betrayed, and discarded in a commodity culture, which is pretty much the story of Jackson's life. The cult of self, which Jackson embodied, dominates our culture. This cult has within it the classic traits of psychopaths: superficial charm, grandiosity, and self-importance, a need for constant stimulation, a penchant for lying, deception, and manipulation, and the incapacity for remorse or guilt. Jackson, from his phony marriages to the portraits of himself dressed as royalty, to his insatiable hunger for new toys, to his questionable relationships with young boys, had all these qualities. And this is also the ethic promoted by corporations. It is the ethic of unfettered capitalism. It is the misguided belief that personal style and personal advancement, mistaken for individualism, are the same as democratic equality. It is the celebration of image over substance. We have a right in the cult of the self to get whatever we desire. We can do anything, even belittle and destroy those around us, including our friends, to make money, to be happy, and to become famous. Once fame and wealth are achieved, they become their own justification, their own morality. How one gets there is irrelevant. And it is this perverted ethic that gave us Wall Street bankers and investment houses, that willfully trashed the global economy, stole money from tens of millions of small shareholders who had bought stock in these corporations for retirement or college. The heads of these corporations, like the winners on a reality television program who lied and manipulated others to succeed, walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses and compensation. The ethic of Wall Street is the ethic of celebrity. But the tantalizing illusions offered by our consumer culture are vanishing as we head towards collapse. The ability of the corporate state to pacify the country by extending credit and providing cheap manufactured goods to the masses is gone. The jobs we are shedding are not coming back, as Lawrence Summers tacitly acknowledges when he talks of a jobless recovery. The belief that democracy lies in the choice between competing brands and the accumulation of vast sums of personal wealth at the expense of others has been exposed as a fraud. Freedom can no longer be conflated with the free market. The travails of the poor are rapidly becoming the travails of the middle class, especially as unemployment insurance runs out. And class warfare, once buried under the happy illusion that we were all going to enter an age of prosperity with unfettered capitalism, is returning with a vengeance. In his book, Democracy Incorporated, Sheldon Wolin, who taught political philosophy at Berkeley and later at Princeton, uses the phrase inverted totalitarianism to describe our political system. Inverted totalitarianism, unlike classical totalitarianism, does not revolve around a demagogue or charismatic leader. It finds expression in the anonymity of the corporate state. It purports to cherish democracy, patriotism, and the Constitution, while manipulating internal levers to subvert and thwart the democratic process. Political candidates are elected in popular votes by citizens, but are ruled by armies of corporate lobbyists in Washington or state capitals who author the legislation and get the legislators to pass it. A corporate media controls nearly everything we read, watch, or hear, and imposes a bland uniformity of opinion. It diverts us with trivia and celebrity gossip. In classical totalitarian regimes, such as Nazi fascism or Soviet communism, economics was subordinate to politics. Under inverted totalitarianism, the reverse is true, Wolin writes. Economics dominates politics, and with that domination comes different forms of ruthlessness. The Obama brand offers us an image that appears radically individualistic and new. This image inoculates us from seeing that the old engines of corporate power and the vast military-industrial complex continue to plunder the country. Brand Obama is about being happy consumers. We are entertained, we feel hopeful, we like our president, we believe he is like us. But like all branded products spun out from the manipulative world of corporate advertising, we are being duped into doing and supporting a lot of things that are not in our interest. A few weeks before Obama won the presidential elections, Obama beat Nike, Apple, Coors, and Zappos to win the Association of National Advertisers' top annual award, Marketer of the Year. But for all our faith and hope has the Obama brand given us, his administration has spent, lent, or guaranteed $12.8 trillion in taxpayer dollars to Wall Street and insolvent banks in a doomed effort to reinflate the bubble economy, a tactic that at best forestalls catastrophe and will leave us broke in a time of profound crisis. Brand Obama has allocated nearly $1 trillion in defense-related spending and the continuation of our doomed imperial project in Iraq, where military planners now estimate that between 50 and 70,000 troops will remain for the next 15 to 20 years. Brand Obama has expanded the war in Afghanistan, including the use of drones sent on cross-border bombing runs into Pakistan that have left some 700 civilians dead since Obama took office. Brand Obama has refused to ease restrictions so workers can organize, and because of pressure from the for-profit healthcare industry, refuses to consider single-payer, not-for-profit healthcare for all Americans. Brand Obama permitted 2.8 million people to lose their homes in 2009 to foreclosure or bank repossessions. That is nearly 8,000 people a day. And they will be joined by another 2.4 million people this year. Brand Obama will not prosecute the Bush administration for war crimes, including the use of torture, and has refused to dismantle Bush's secrecy laws or restore habeas corpus. Corporations which control our politics no longer produce products that are different, but brands that are different. Brand Obama does not threaten the core of the corporate state any more than did brand George W. Bush. The Bush brand collapsed. We became immune to its studied folksiness. We saw through its artifice. And this is a common deflation in the world of advertising. So we have been given a new Obama brand with an exciting and faintly erotic appeal. Benetton and Calvin Klein were the precursors to the Obama brand, using ads to associate themselves with risque style and progressive politics. It gave their products an edge. But the goal, as with all brands, was to fool passive consumers that a brand is an experience. The decline of American empire began long before the current economic meltdown or the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It began before the first Gulf War or Ronald Reagan. It began when we shifted, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, from an empire of production to an empire of consumption. By the end of the Vietnam War, when the costs of the war ate away at Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and domestic oil production began its slow, steady, inexorable decline, we saw our country transformed from one that primarily produced to one that primarily consumed. We started borrowing to maintain a level of consumption, as well as an empire, we could no longer afford. We began to use force, especially in the Middle East, to feed our insatiable thirst for cheap oil. And the bill is now due. America's most dangerous enemies are not Islamic radicals, but those who sold us the perverted ideology of free market capitalism and globalization. They have dynamited the very foundations of our society. In the 17th century, these speculators would have been hung. Today they run the government and consume billions in taxpayer subsidies. These corporate forces will never permit real reform. It would mean their extinction, the oil and natural gas industry will never allow us to achieve energy independence. That would devastate their profits. Real reform would wipe out tens of billions of dollars in weapons contracts. It would cripple the financial health of a host of private contractors, from Lockheed Martin to Boeing to Northrop Grumman to Raytheon to Halliburton. And it would render obsolete the existence of the U.S. Central Command. It was Bill Clinton who led the Democratic Party to the corporate watering trough. Clinton argued that the party could ditch labor unions, no longer a source of votes or power, as a political ally. Workers, he insisted, would vote Democratic anyway. They had no choice. It was better, he argued, to take corporate money and do corporate bidding. By the 1990s, the Democratic Party, under Clinton's leadership, had virtual fundraising parity with the Republicans. Today, the Democrats get more. The legislation demanded by corporations, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, thrust a knife into the back of the American working class. NAFTA was peddled by the Clinton White House as an opportunity to raise incomes and prosperity of the citizens of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. NAFTA would also, we were told, staunch Mexican immigration into the United States. But NAFTA, which took effect in 1994, reversed every one of Clinton's predictions. Once the Mexican government lifted price supports on corn and beans grown by Mexican farmers, those farmers had to compete against the huge agribusinesses in the United States. Many Mexican farmers were swiftly bankrupt. At least 2 million Mexican farmers have been driven off their land since 1994. And guess where many of them went? This desperate flight of poor Mexicans into the United States is now being exacerbated by large-scale factory closures along the border, as manufacturers pack up and leave Mexico for China. But we were assured that goods would be cheaper, workers would be wealthier, everyone would be happier. I'm not sure how these contradictory things were supposed to happen, but in a soundbite society, reality no longer matters. NAFTA was great if you were a corporation. It was a disaster if you were a worker. And we are now getting a taste of Clinton's draconian welfare reform bill signed in 1996, as tens of millions of people face the prospect of losing their unemployment benefits and surviving, or attempting to survive, on the $143 a month you receive from welfare. It was the Clinton administration, led by Summers, which signed into law the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999. The act ripped down the firewalls that had been established by the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, designed to prevent the kind of meltdown we are now experiencing. Glass-Steagall established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It set in place banking reforms to stop speculators from hijacking the financial system. With Glass-Steagall demolished and the passage of NAFTA, the Democrats, led by Clinton, tumbled gleefully into bed with corporations and Wall Street speculators. And many of the architects of this deregulation, economists such as Summers, have come back to serve corporate interests in the Obama White House. The cost of our empire of illusion is not being paid for by corporate titans. It is being paid for on the streets of our inner cities, in former manufacturing towns, and in depressed and rural enclaves. Human beings are not commodities. They are not goods. Their misery is not morally excusable because of the demands of the market. They grieve and suffer and feel despair. They lose their dignity with their jobs, their sense of self-worth, and frequently struggle in unemployment with depression. Human beings, not corporations, raise children, and maintain communities. And the growing class divide is not understood, despite the glibness of many in the media, by complicated sets of statistics, lines on a graph that charts stocks, or the absurd utopian faith in unregulated globalization and complicated trade deals. It is understood in the eyes of a man or woman who is no longer making enough money to live with dignity and hope. It is understood in this profound and expanding despair. The desperation spreading across the United States is unleashing not simply a recession. We have been in a recession for some years now, but a depression unlike anything we have seen since the 1930s. It has provided a pool of broken people willing to work for low wages and to do without unions or benefits. For the bottom 90% of Americans, annual income has been on a slow, steady decline for 3 decades. There are 50 million Americans in real poverty and tens of millions of Americans in a category called near poverty. 1 in 8 Americans and 1 in 4 children depend on food stamps to eat. The assault on the American working class, an assault that has devastated members of my own family in the former mill towns in the state of Maine, shows no sign of abatement. In the past 3 years, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. workers were laid off. Among workers laid off from full-time work, roughly 1/4 were earning less than $40,000 a year. And there are whole sections of the United States that now resemble the developing world. There has been a Weimarization of the American working class, and the assault on the middle class is underway. Anything that can be digitalized, from finance to architecture to engineering, can and is being outsourced to workers in countries such as India or China, who accept pay a fraction of that of their Western counterparts and work without benefits. And both the Republican and Democratic parties, beholden to corporations for money and power, are responsible. Washington has become our Versailles. The media has evolved into a class of courtiers. The Democrats, like the Republicans, are mostly courtiers. Our pundits, academic experts, and financial analysts, at least those with prominent public platforms, are courtiers. We are captivated by the hollow stagecraft of political theater as we are ruthlessly stripped of power. The role of courtiers is to parrot official propaganda. Courtiers do not defy the elite or question the structure of the corporate state. The corporations, in return, employ them and promote them as celebrities or elected officials. Courtiers in face powder deceive us in the name of journalism. Courtiers in our political parties promise to look out for our interests and pass bill after bill to further corporate fraud and abuse. And no class of courtiers, from the eunuchs behind the Manchus in the 19th century to the Baghdad caliphs in the Abbasid Caliphate, has ever transformed itself into a responsible and socially productive class. Courtiers are hedonists of power. Being a courtier requires agility and eloquence, and the most talented of them should be credited as persuasive actors. They entertain us, they appear to be our friends, they make us feel good. They are the smiley faces of a corporate state that has hijacked the government. And when these corporations make their iron demands, the courtiers drop to their knees. They placate the telecommunication companies that want to be protected from lawsuits. They permit oil and gas companies to rake in obscene profits and keep in place the vast subsidies of corporate welfare doled out by the state. They allow our profit-driven healthcare system to leave the uninsured and underinsured to suffer and die. And over 40,000 Americans died last year because they could not get proper medical care. The for-profit healthcare industry, like the defense industry, makes money from death and suffering. It is legally permitted to hold a sick child in our country hostage, while their families frantically bankrupt themselves to save their sons or daughters. Any discussion of health care should acknowledge the fact that our for-profit healthcare system is the problem and must be destroyed. Only then can we have an honest debate about what comes next. But this will never happen. It will never happen because the industry's money and lobbyists drive the media discussion, as well as the shape of the so-called healthcare reform bill. And the courtiers in Washington and on the television screens dance to the tune they play. America is devolving into a third world nation. And if we do not immediately halt our elites' rapacious looting of the public treasury and our bizarre state socialism for corporations, we will be left with trillions in debts which can never be repaid and widespread human misery which we will be helpless to ameliorate. Our anemic democracy will be replaced with a robust national police state. The elite will withdraw into heavily guarded, gated communities where they will have access to security, goods, and services that cannot be afforded by the rest of us. Tens of millions of people, brutally controlled, will live in perpetual poverty, a state of neo-feudalism. This is the inevitable result of unchecked corporate capitalism. The stimulus and bailout plans are not about saving us. They are about saving them. As the economist Paul Krugman has noted, anyone who has seen how economic statistics are constructed knows that they are really a subgenre of science fiction. This science fiction has been steadily employed to camouflage our economic decline. Ronald Reagan included 1.5 million U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine service personnel with the civilian workforce to magically reduce the nation's unemployment rate by 2%. Clinton decided that those who had given up looking for work, or those who wanted full-time jobs but could only find part-time employment, were no longer to be counted as unemployed. His trick disappeared some 5 million unemployed from the official unemployment rolls. If you work more than 21 hours a week, and most low-wage workers at places like Walmart average 28 hours a week, you are counted as employed, although your real wages put you below the poverty line. Our actual unemployment rate, when you include those who have stopped looking for work and those who can only find poorly paid part-time jobs, is not 10%, but somewhere between 17 and 20%. A sixth of the country is now effectively unemployed, and we are shedding jobs at a faster rate than in the months after the 1929 crash. Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized the danger of unregulated capitalism. He sent a message to Congress on April 29, 1938, titled, "Recommendations to the Congress to Curb Monopolies and the Concentration of Economic Power." In it, he wrote, "The first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism, ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power. The second truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if its business system does not provide employment and produce and distribute goods in such a way to sustain an acceptable standard of living. The rise of the corporate state has grave political consequences, as we saw in Italy and Germany in the early part of the 20th century. Antitrust laws not only regulate and control the marketplace, they serve as bulwarks to protect democracy. And now that they are gone, now that we have a state run by and on behalf of corporations, we must expect inevitable and, I fear, terrifying consequences. As the pressure mounts, as this despair and desperation reaches into larger and larger segments of the populace, the mechanisms of corporate and government control are being bolstered to prevent civil unrest and instability. The emergence of the corporate state always means the emergence of the security state. This is why the Bush White House pushed through the Patriot Act and its renewal, the suspension of habeas corpus, the practice of extraordinary rendition, warrantless wiretapping on American citizens, and the refusal to ensure free and fair elections with verifiable ballot counting. The motive behind these measures is not to fight terrorism or to bolster national security. It is to seize and maintain internal control, and it is about control of us. Senator Frank Church, as chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence in 1975, investigated the government's massive and highly secretive National Security Agency. He was alarmed at the ability of the state to intrude into private lives. He wrote, when he finished his investigation, "That capacity at any time could be turned around on the American people, and no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capacity to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back. Because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know." When Senator Church made this statement, the National Security Agency was not authorized to spy on American citizens. Today, it is. In his book, The Great Transformation, written in 1944, Karl Polanyi laid out the devastating consequences, the depressions, wars, and totalitarianism that grow out of a so-called self-regulated free market. Polanyi grasped that fascism, like socialism, was rooted in a market society that refused to function. He warned that a financial system always devolved without heavy government control into a mafia capitalism and a mafia political system. All traditional standards and beliefs are shattered in a severe economic crisis. The moral order is turned upside down. The honest and industrious are wiped out, while the gangsters, profiteers, and speculators walk away with millions. The utopian belief in globalization, as non-reality based as Marxist determinism, means the innate forces of economics and the marketplace, rather than human beings, are supposed to guide our behavior, although there is nothing in 3,000 years of economic history to justify this absurdity. The touted benefits of globalization have been exposed as a lie, as John Ralston Saul has detailed in his book, The Collapse of Globalism. The lowering of national residency requirements for corporations has become a tool for massive tax evasion. The idea of a global economic system has turned poverty into a norm. The decline of the middle class, the very basis of democracy, has become the inevitable result of progress. The huge reduction of incomes to the working class and lower middle class, even parts of the middle class, forcing them to survive with more than one job per person, is callously dismissed as the punishment for not keeping up. The contrast between multi-million-dollar bonuses for corporate managers and four-job families has institutionalized the oligarchic state and staggering inequalities. For 2 decades, an elite consensus insisted that unsustainable third-world debts would not be put aside in a sort of bad debt reserve without betraying globalism's essential principles and moral obligations, which included unwavering respect for the sanctity of international contracts, Saul wrote. It took the same people about 2 weeks to abandon sanctity and propose bad debt for their own far larger debts in 2009. A self-regulating market inevitably turns human beings and the natural environment into commodities, a situation that ensures the destruction of both society and the natural world. The free market's assumption that nature and human beings are objects whose worth is determined by the market allows each to be exploited for profit until exhaustion or collapse. A society that no longer recognizes that nature and human life have a sacred dimension, an intrinsic value beyond monetary value, commits collective suicide. Such societies cannibalize themselves until they die. And we face an environmental meltdown that is linked to our economic meltdown. Polar ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, the planet is warming at an alarming rate. Droughts are destroying croplands. Russia's northern coastline has begun producing huge quantities of toxic methane gas. Scientists with the International Siberian Shelf Study described what they saw along the coastline recently as methane chimneys reaching from the sea floor to the ocean's surface. Methane, locked in the permafrost of Arctic landmasses, is being released at an alarming rate as average Arctic temperatures rise. Methane is a greenhouse gas 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. The release of millions of tons of it will significantly accelerate the rate of global warming. The continued release of large quantities of methane, some scientists have warned, could actually asphyxiate the human species. But even in the face of this crisis, the oil and natural gas industry, along with the coal industry, have blunted serious reform. Profit comes before the urgent task to save the ecosystem on which human life depends. Our working class, which has desperately borrowed money to stay afloat as real wages have dropped, now face years, maybe decades of stagnant or declining incomes without access to new credit. The national treasury is being drained on behalf of speculative commercial interests. The government, the only institution citizens have that is big enough and powerful enough to protect its rights, is becoming weaker, more anemic, and increasingly unable to help the mass of Americans who are embarking on a period of profound deprivation. We have been borrowing at the rate of more than $2 billion a day over the last 10 years, and at some point it has to end. Because of the bailouts, stimulus packages, giveaways, and short-term debt, we will have to finance $12 trillion in debt. That is over $80,000 for every American worker. This is also about $96 billion in debt that has to be auctioned off every week. If China and the oil-rich states do not buy this debt, the buyer of last resort will be the Federal Reserve. And this will have the effect of essentially printing endless amounts of money. Our currency, at this point, will become junk. A furious and sustained backlash by a betrayed and angry populace, one unprepared intellectually, emotionally, or psychologically for collapse, will sweep aside the Democrats and most of the Republicans. It was the economic collapse in Yugoslavia that gave us Slobodan Milosevic. It was the Weimar Republic that vomited up Adolf Hitler. And it was the breakdown in Tsarist Russia that opened the door for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. A cobble of proto-fascist misfits, from Christian demagogues to loudmouth talk show hosts who we naively dismiss as buffoons, will find a following with promises of revenge and moral renewal. There are powerful corporate entities arrayed against us, and these anti-democratic forces will seek to make an alliance with the radical Christian right and other extremists. They will use fear, chaos, the hatred for the ruling elites, and the specter of left-wing dissent and terrorism to impose draconian controls to extinguish our democracy. And while they do it, they will be waving the American flag, chanting patriotic slogans, promising law and order, and clutching the Christian cross. Totalitarianism, George Orwell pointed out, is not so much an age of faith, but an age of schizophrenia. A society becomes totalitarian when its structure becomes flagrantly artificial, Orwell wrote. That is, when its ruling class has lost its function, but succeeds in clinging to power by force or fraud. And force is soon all the elites will have left. And yet, even in the face of catastrophe, mass culture assures us that if we close our eyes, if we visualize what we want, if we have faith in ourselves, if we tell God that we believe in miracles, if we focus on happiness, our lives will be harmonious and complete. This cultural retreat into illusion, whether peddled by positive psychologists, Hollywood, or Christian preachers, is a form of magical thinking. It turns worthless mortgages and debt into wealth. It turns the destruction of our manufacturing base into an opportunity for growth. It turns alienation and anxiety into a cheerful conformity. It turns a nation that wages illegal wars and administers offshore penal colonies where it openly practices torture into the greatest democracy on earth. How will we cope with our decline? Will we cling to the absurd dreams of an imperial superpower and the fantasies of a glorious tomorrow? Or will we responsibly face our new limitations? Will we heed those who are sober and rational, those who speak of a new simplicity and humility in an age of imperial as well as material decline? Or will we follow the demagogues and charlatans that rise up in moments of crisis and panic to offer fantastic visions of new glory? Will we radically transform our system to one that protects the ordinary citizen and fosters the common good, that defies the corporate state, that dismantles empire? Or will we employ the brutality and technology of our internal security and surveillance apparatus to crush dissent and drive us into a new dark age? If Obama does not end the flagrant theft of taxpayer funds by corporations and the disgraceful abandonment of our working class, especially as foreclosures and unemployment mount, many in the country will turn in desperation to the far right, embodied by groups such as Christian radicals. The failure to offer a democratic, populist alternative, the only alternative remaining that can save our open society, to openly make war on corporate power, will mean there will be, in the eyes of many embittered and struggling working and middle class Americans, no alternative left, but a perverted Christian fascism. I spent 2 years traveling the country to write a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War on America. I visited former manufacturing towns where for many the end of the world is no longer an abstraction. They have lost hope. Fear and instability have plunged the working class into profound personal and economic despair, and not surprisingly into the arms of demagogues in the radical Christian right who offer a belief in magic, miracles, and the fiction of a utopian Christian nation. And unless we rapidly re-enfranchise these dispossessed workers back into the economy, unless we give them meaningful employment, relief from crippling mortgages, an end to foreclosures, and a healthcare system that does not drive them into bankruptcy, our democracy is doomed. Democracies, as Plutarch and Thucydides understood, cannot be sustained in oligarchic states. Social and political reform never comes from accommodating the power structure. It comes from frightening it. The Liberty Party, which fought slavery, the suffragists who battled for women's rights, the labor movement, and the civil rights movements knew that the question, as Karl Popper wrote, was not how do we get good people to rule. Most of those attracted to power are at best mediocrities and often venal. But how do we limit the damage the powerful do to us? These mass movements were the real engines for social reform, the correctives to our democracy, and the true protectors of the rights of citizens. They never achieved formal political power, but they are a reminder that, as Studs Terkel used to say, hope has never trickled down. It has always sprung up. We must articulate and stand firmly and unequivocally, even if this turns us at first into outcasts, on the side of working men and women. We must no longer be content with the crumbs tossed to us by the power elite in the vain hope that accommodation will work. We must become as militant as those who are seeking our enslavement. If we remain passive, we will soon be engulfed by a ruthless totalitarian capitalism. If we remain passive, as we undergo the largest transference of wealth upwards in American history, we will become serfs. If we fight back, we have a chance. The saturation coverage of Jackson's death was yet another example of our collective flight into illusion. It deflected the moral questions arising from mounting injustice, growing inequalities, costly imperial wars, economic collapse, and political corruption. As we sink into an economic and political morass, as we barrel towards a crisis that will create more misery than the Great Depression, we remain controlled, manipulated, and distracted by the celluloid shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. The fantasy of celebrity culture is not designed simply to entertain. It is designed to drain us emotionally, confuse us about our identity, blame ourselves for our predicament, condition us to chase illusions of unachievable fame and happiness, and keep us from fighting back. And in the end, that is all the Jackson coverage was really about. Another tawdry and tasteless spectacle to divert a dying culture from the baying wolf at the gate. Thank you.
I read your book, War is a Course That Gives Us Meaning, and you described a lot of the tactics of war in terms of like the demonization and the annihilation of the in War is a Course That Gives Us Meaning, you describe a lot of the tactics of the warmongers, the demonization of the enemy, the annihilation of their humanity, so on and so forth. And since I've read that, I've started to use that framework to look at the ideological warfares in our society and the engine for polemics that's going on, like in talk radio and Fox News and all that. I'm wondering, how do we, first of all, deconstruct that sort of polemic in our society, and then how do we help others around us, our fellow citizens, deconstruct that as it plays out just in our civil discourse?
Well, I find many parallels between what's happening now and what I saw in the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia. The war in Yugoslavia was not caused by ancient ethnic hatreds. It was caused by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. $9 billion in debt that they couldn't pay back, a refusal to renegotiate, economic crisis, the closure of large state-run factories, huge unemployment, finally an inflation rate of 25,000%. And Yugoslavs had a position in Eastern Europe very similar to Americans in that they had a relatively high standard of living. 1,500 Deutschmark was the average salary a month, 2 months off vacation, free health care. There were only 4 countries in the world where Yugoslavs needed a visa, and so they were least prepared for this because, like the United States, they had come to expect a relatively high standard of living. And what happened? Well, that economic collapse was used by nationalist demagogues who immediately took over the airwaves and pumped forth filth and hatred. You don't have to change many words to hear the same kind of message that dominates our airwaves. And it was compounded in Yugoslavia, as it is compounded here, by a bankrupt liberalism. The liberal class in the United States used to stand with the working class. The Democratic Party used to be the party that traditionally protected labor and the working class. And it was really primarily under Clinton that ended. So the rage, legitimate rage on the part of dispossessed workers is directed, and I think correctly, at liberals who continue to speak very hypocritically about their concern for workers' rights and a democratic equality, but have backed a party that has ruthlessly stripped the working class of an ability to make a living. I mean, I've gone through this personally, and I'm sure there are people in this room who have. The towns that my family, these are all old mill towns, are utterly devastated. The bank is gone and boarded up. I mean, it looks like a war zone. And this has just been writ large at manufacturing centers throughout the country. So we continue to speak in a kind of bloodless language of policy and issues without grasping that rage, which is being expressed in Tea Party meetings and militias and oath keepers, is a legitimate rage. And Richard Rorty, right before he died, wrote a short but very thoughtful book called Achieving Our Country. It's a brilliant book, actually. I mean, he saw all of this coming. And in it, he writes that part of the reaction on the part of this dispossessed working class will be a resurgence of overt racism, because the anger towards the liberals will carry with it everything that the liberal college-educated elite has espoused in terms of political correctness. So you saw Tea Party members on the Mall in Washington during the health care vote when they shouted racial slurs at John Lewis and called Representative Barney Frank a faggot. And I thought immediately of Rorty, that the longer that we fail to recognize the right on the part of working men and women to express the rage that they're expressing, the more it will be co-opted by movements that seek the destruction of our democratic state. So, I find so many of the antecedents to war. It comes through the corruption of language. When you get people to speak violently, it's not hard then finally to get them to act violently. The dehumanization of immigrants, Muslims. It's terrifying stuff. Language is not benign. And I spoke yesterday to Noam Chomsky, who said that in his view, we are in the latter stages of Weimar Germany. That really we have very little time left, and he's probably right. I know the working class can't take much more. This healthcare bill, when you look at the fine print, is awful. It'll force them to buy this defective product. They can still have co-payments, premiums jacked up, especially if they get ill or if they're elderly on a fixed income. It's a disaster. So, yeah, I find many parallels to the tremors that I saw in societies that disintegrated. It's not theoretical for me. I've seen it before.
Talk about the implications of dispossession, or as I interpret it, mainly for white people, and I'm wondering how you would discuss that in terms of people of color and members of minority
Well, I
religious
mean,
groups.
the people of color will be the target. Immigrants and African Americans very high on the list. Homosexuals. I think we can. The Tea Party movement is not a fascist movement. It doesn't overtly call for violence. It doesn't call for the extermination or liquidation of the immigrant class. But it's very close. I spoke with Fritz Stern, probably our greatest living scholar on fascism, taught at Columbia, and himself fled Nazi Germany as a teenager in the 1930s. And all of his scholarship was pre-1933, before the Nazis came to power, and he kept asking relentlessly, how did it happen? Why did it happen? What made it happen? And his book, The Politics of Cultural Despair, is the classic sort of study of that. But Fritz said, in Germany, there was a yearning for fascism before the word fascism was invented. And I think that yearning is what we're watching right now. And it's terrifying. So I think for people of color, I worry a lot about Muslims in this country, what will happen to Muslims. The rhetoric already against Muslims is overtly racist. The kinds of things we say about Muslims in the mainstream, we probably couldn't say about any other ethnic group. So yeah, I'm terrified.
I'm very thankful for your lecture right now, and I think that you are very much influenced by Karl Polanyi. I wonder what Karl Polanyi would have talked about American capitalism and self-regulatory mechanism of market in current context. The other question is, do you think any hope is alive for American working class, and what kind of left movements, together with the religious left as well as liberal class, have any stake in the current context?
Well, I think Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, is the classic study of unregulated capitalism, and that's why I quoted it, because he understands that, Lenin said that capitalism is a revolutionary force when it's unleashed. And I think we're seeing it, capitalism functioning as a revolutionary force. And let me be clear, I'm not against capitalism, but there are different forms of capitalism. When I grew up in a small farm town, and that penny capitalism of the farmers when they brought their goods in for sale is a healthy form of capitalism. The kind of regional capitalism where you had the owner of the drugstore, the hardware store, who lived in the community, reinvested in the community, served on the school board, is a healthy form of capitalism. What is not healthy, and this is what Polanyi, I think, understood, is unfettered capitalism, which creates corporate capitalism, which is supranational. It no longer cares about the interests of a community or a nation state. It just bleeds it dry. And that's, of course, the danger. It's corporate capitalism. In terms of hope, I think we have to begin to stand with, you know, it really is economic. We have to begin to talk about a living wage. We have to begin to talk about, because you cross ideological boundaries. A worker at Walmart, even if they're, you know, the most rabid Tea Party follower, will connect with you if you're talking about a living wage, or you're talking about, you know, proper health benefits. I mean, it's got to be these kinds of issues. A moratorium on foreclosures. I mean, that's the only kind of language that we should speak. And if we don't, the effort has to be not to argue with them ideologically, but create economic space where they can be reintegrated back into the society. Because if they are pushed out, and I use that term Weimarization, if you cast aside that huge underclass, then you always create political extremism. And that's what we're doing. So the solution is economic. And the Democratic Party is not doing it.
I was struck by your point that reform and hope tend to trickle up from the masses. A lot of people here are probably interested in journalism careers or media studies. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how the media needs to reform, the news media and journalism need to reform to help fix all of these problems. If you can give us a...
Well, I think part of the, you know, you can answer this question better than I can, but I mean, the commercialization of the American press was a kind of Faustian bargain because, I mean, for me, the role of journalism is to give a voice to people who within the society, without your presence, would not have a voice. And that's not the powerful. Great journalism stands on the side of people who need a journalist in order to make them visible. And of course, part of the problem with a corporatized media is that large sections of the United States, the poor, the working class, have become invisible. Their voices have not been heard, which only fuels the kind of rage that we're seeing. And we'll see tomorrow with these Tea Party protests. So I think journalism forgot its mission. Newspapers went through an area where they made a lot of money. And they forgot who they were writing for. And I think, I mean, there's many, of course, I mean, the fundamental problem with papers is that the role that they played connecting buyers with sellers is now redundant. Buyers don't need papers to connect with sellers. So the economic function of newspapers is gone. And I don't know how we're going to sustain journalism. I mean, in the end, I mean, you can do it for a while for nothing, but, you know, we all have to pay rent, finally. And it's going to, I don't know economically how we're going to sustain it. I don't know, the internet isn't going to do it. So, and that blinking out of newspapers, I mean, we have, isn't the Star in bankruptcy? Yeah, so the Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, San Francisco Chronicle, LA, they're all in bankruptcy. Now imagine, with all the faults of papers, imagine losing a newspaper in a major city. Nobody's going to go down to the courts. Nobody's going to cover police. I mean, the ability for malfeasance, corruption, and abuse of power will just skyrocket. So the collapse of the traditional media is part of this whole equation of corporatism. It's just one less check on the abuse of power. And we already see the papers are so anemic now. There's almost nothing in them.
Mr. Hedges, you cited numerous problems with the healthcare system as it stands today. You argued very forcefully that the problem with that system, the fundamental problem, is the profit motive. And I want to inquire about the problems with the press that you noted and the system of courtiers, as you put it, that exist in the corporate media today. Is the profit motive the problem there, And is publicly financed not-for-profit media, as some have suggested, the only answer?
Well, the profit motive is the problem, of course. And, you know, why does a figure like Katie Couric earn $50 million a year? It's not because she's a great journalist. I don't think Katie Couric could, you know, report and write a story if you put a gun to her head. She's a celebrity. She's a news personality. She has the ability to make you feel a sense of intimacy. And that's what television news personalities do. It's nothing to do with news. So the profit, yeah, I mean, it was always an uneasy relationship, but you still could, you know, the press was never as sort of courageous as it liked to make it appear, but you could, within that structure, still do serious and good journalism. And I don't know how we're going to sustain it. I don't know how we're going to pay for it. Foreign bureaus have closed, national bureaus. I mean, I was an investigative reporter for the New York Times, and it, you know, it takes, it's not, it's a trade. I don't pretend it's a profession, but, you know, being a good carpenter takes 10 years. I mean, being a good journalist takes a long time. It's not a matter of opening a laptop and just sort of, you know, blogging. And it takes money. I mean, investigative journalism takes money. Week after week after week, it takes time to produce and research and get facts and find sources. And I don't know how it's going to be sustained. I don't think it's going to come from the government, as Nichols and McChesney have proposed, because we have a corporate state that has no interest in real journalism. The corporatized media has shown quite happily what kind of journalism they promote, and it's, you know, we break live for Tiger Woods. Octomom is moving to Hollywood. This isn't news. It's not journalism. And it's utterly corrupted the commercial airwaves, and the last bulwark of professional journalism, which is print journalism, is dying. So I don't know.
I just want to thank you for coming to our school and sharing your beliefs, and I just want to say, you know, I hold some of the same beliefs, and I agree with everything you say has happened. What I'm just curious to hear your perspective on, do you feel using fear as a method to teach the masses, like you've done here tonight, a way of examining our conscience just the same as the media who you condemn for using fear to control the masses? Do you feel that you know, is your approach is the same as the media's, and having resentment and frustration under your message?
Well, there's a huge difference, because they're trying to make you afraid of internal, external enemies. I'm trying to make you afraid of them. So it's, they're trying to make you afraid so they can consolidate power. As Randolph Bourne said, you know, war is the health of the state. The more they make you afraid, the more paralyzed you become. I'm trying to point out that they are the problem, and that if we remain in a state of paralysis, then we're going to be fleeced and controlled. So it's a completely different focus. And I think the bottom, or the undercurrent of my message is stop being afraid and stand up, because if you don't, we're finished.
Can I ask one quick question?
Okay, final question.
You referenced back to Nazism's rise, and I know a lot of it was chop off the head of journalism, or news reporting, etc. There's a lot different today, as I see it, relative to, and maybe a show of hands in this room. How many of you could raise a cell phone that you could take a video on and email it to tens of thousands of people in about 3 minutes? Show of hands. That type of communication never occurred in the past historically. It's yeah. If the Star Tribune goes black, if there's police corruption, if there, there are going to be cell phones on everything, and it's going to be all over the world. And I'm not saying it's an organized news organization, but it comes down to accountability and being able to point out some of those things. Where does something like that fit?
Well, then, I mean, that posits the idea that all information can be captured in images. And having worked with television crews most of my reporting life, most of the really important stories can't be captured in images. The problem with an image is that it doesn't put anything in context. You saw it in the invasion of Iraq. In real time, we had footage, filmed from the back of a Humvee. And the reporter assumed the role of a sports commentator, describing what the viewer was seeing. Well, we're going over this berm. Oh, the Harriers just attacked that position. That's not reporting. We're still left. We may have an emotional reaction to an image, but we still don't understand what's happening around us. And Neil Postman wrote about this in Amusing Ourselves to Death. To think that the image is going to substitute for the printed word, I think, is very naive. A print-based society deals in complexity and nuance and ambiguity. A society that relies on images and spectacle is an emotionally driven society, not a rationally driven society. So I fear the decline of print because it thrusts us into a new paradigm, one where we confuse how we feel or how we are made to feel with knowledge. Thank you.